The MOT is safe, but is it really fit for purpose? This is the first of a two-part episode on the future of the MOT. Welcome to the Auto Repair Focus podcast. I'm going to be talking to Frank Harvey, Head of Member Services at the Independent Garage Association, about the MOT. Back in January, the MOT was saved once again after a challenge to turn it from a 311 system that we're also used to a 411 system, whereby the first time a car would be presented for its annual check would be after 4 years rather than 3. The government consultation was launched in January 2023 and saw an amazing response from both the aftermarket and the public, all overwhelmingly against the idea of changing the frequency. But ideas were brought up about the future of the MOT. And with new technologies coming into the automotive sector, including electric vehicles and more ADAS, is it about time the MOT was slightly changed for the future to ensure these technologies remain safe? And is the MOT actually safe itself, or can we expect further threats to its frequency and to its pricing in the future? Frank, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Phil.
So the MOT, now it's safe at the moment. I mean, how relieved are you and how relieved is the IGA that the MOT is staying at its current frequency after the consultation?
Yeah, rather than relief, I think it's really common sense has prevailed. I mean, the UK has got one of the best road safety records in the world, and I think to put that in any sort of jeopardy would be the wrong thing to do. I think motorists probably always think that the annual MOT is a bit of a thorn in their side, but in reality, it keeps us all safe. That's pedestrians, cyclists, road users. I think it's important that we maintain that. And there's a lot of unknowns now. I mean, in the consultation, for those that took a look at it, there was a lot of reference to EV. EVs are still very, very new.
Mm.
The largest number are now getting to that 3 years for the first MOT. And again, speaking to members, speaking to people in the industry, they're seeing EVs with well in excess of 100,000 miles. And if you think about that, we don't really know what to expect with them as they get to that first MOT.
Mm.
So I think to push that down the road would have been a mistake.
Well, that's another question I was going to actually ask. One of the reasons the government gave for even consulting on the MOT frequency in the first place was that cars are becoming more reliable.
Mhm.
But are they really? Because as you said, new technologies coming through, drivers don't understand some of these technologies. And when it comes to EVs as well, I mean, one of the figures that was bandied around was the tire wear and how heavy they are. So,
Yes.
are cars really more reliable today?
I think ultimately they are more reliable. Excuse me. Ultimately, they're more reliable, but also things still wear out. Tires wear out, wiper blades wear out, lights fail. It's they don't break down as much, but breakdown doesn't come into the MOT. And there's all sorts of other bits and pieces. The MOT just doesn't look at breakdowns, and also it doesn't mean that a vehicle is roadworthy. You've got to remember that the MOT is a snapshot in time. And it's actually the responsibility of the driver and user of the car to make sure it's roadworthy. One of the other things that they talked about was cars over 40 years old.
Mm.
Um, they're typically enthusiast owned, but again, that's down to the individual to make sure that that car's roadworthy. It might not need an MOT
Mm.
to be used on the road, but it's still got to be in a roadworthy condition. And I think there's a danger if you confuse the two.
Mm.
So going back to the EV bit and are cars more reliable? Yes, they are more reliable. Do they still go wrong? Do they still wear things out? Absolutely, they do.
Exactly. And I think as well, I would imagine we're seeing, again, during the COVID period, COVID-19 period, we saw drivers reducing their mileage, did more working from home. People didn't want to go out as much now. We're getting
Yeah,
back into that era of increased mileage, aren't we? So again,
we are.
MOT, as you said, it's a snapshot in time, and it's that yearly snapshot that hopefully gives drivers an opportunity to think about, checking their car every month, 3 months, 6 months, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And we talked about the COVID and the MOT exemption and everything else, and we saw the slump in that sort of for that April to June time. Um, Looking at current government statistics, that's leveling out again now. So we're starting to see that sort of gap and that slump even out, and the peak towards the end of the year flatten out a little bit. Um, and that in itself shows the value of MOTs, because it means those vehicles, those users or vehicle owners that got the benefit of the exemption,
Mm,
um, are realizing that they still need to do it, and it's starting to level out. We saw some horror stories once the exemption had been lifted, with members sending pictures in of things that were turning up in their garage. And also, at the time of the exemption, we had members telling us that the customer still wanted an MOT, and can they do it?
mm.
Yes, they can.
You can-
So that's starting to level itself out a little bit now.
And that's good as well, because I think one of the key things to come out of the consultation wasn't just the fact that the aftermarket industry, wanted the MOT to stay the same, but it was an overwhelming support from drivers as well. So if drivers are backing the MOT frequency and bringing their MOTs back in line to level out, as you said, is that a good thing that drivers are aware of the importance of MOTs? Are they getting more aware than they used to be?
I think it's back to that road safety thing. I mean, again, historically, some of us are of an age when cars did used to break down, and if you run a car, you have to have an understanding of how that vehicle works. With the advent that we talked about earlier of the reliability, and we're all guilty now of not lifting the bonnet on a weekly basis. We're waiting for a light to come on and tell us that the washers need topping up and everything else. And I think also it's a generational thing,
Mm,
in that people want that expert advice. They want that third party pair of eyes to look at the vehicle and give them the peace of mind. Carrying our families about in these cars, in these missiles, um, and it's right and proper that they're safed and checked regularly by a professional.
mm, absolutely. I completely agree. It's a generational thing. My dad will, whenever I pull up around there, the first thing he'll do is walk around the car, making sure it's okay. Even though I do that myself, but he's 80 years old, a former engineer, and he does it.
Yeah,
He absolutely loves it. Um, so just to go back to it quickly, I mean, how important is it that the first MOT was at 3 years rather than four?
I, I think again in the consultation that they talked about saving the motorist money.
Mm.
That was a bit of a misnomer, really. If you can afford a vehicle that's 3 years old and you can't afford an MOT, um,
Bit
the,
weird.
the, the sort of, if you like, the ethos behind it was targeting at the wrong audience. And the people that really needed the help and assistance and money saving were probably people that were running the older vehicles. I think the average age of a car now in the UK is over 9 years old.
Mm,
It's when you get to that end that people maybe look at trying to save money where they can. So in reality, it wasn't going to have any impact. They talk about impact on the environment as well in the consultation.
mm.
Um, Again, you're talking about cars that are less polluting anyway.
So,
um, and it's all those things. I think it, it's like anything. It's right. I mean, the government announced this week that they're going to run a review of the DVSA, because they've got to do that on a regular basis.
mm,
And I think it's right and proper that everything is reviewed from time to time. I
mm,
think what's come out of the original conversation earlier in 2023 is that actually, as an industry and as road users, we're actually being listened to.
mm,
And it's also important that when consultations are announced, that everybody gets involved. We all work in the motor trade. It's all served us well, every one of us that work in this sector. Um, and I think it's right and proper that people get involved in that and make their views heard when these sort of consultations are announced. So was it the right thing? Yeah, it was. Getting it to 3 years or holding it at 3 years is right and proper. But equally, I think it should be reviewed again in the future at some point, just to make sure that it's fit for purpose.
Before we continue, I just want to remind you that you can subscribe to the Auto Repair Focus podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, and Amazon Music to make sure that you never miss a future episode. You can find more details on autorepairfocus.com. Just click the podcast tab at the top of the page. Let's get back to the discussion. And actually, talking about fit for purpose, there was the discussion in there as well, wasn't there, about changing the MOT slightly in terms of looking at it from battery electric vehicles, looking at how they can be MOT'd, more emphasis around diesels and diesel emissions, especially when it comes to detecting DPF removal or deletion. So I imagine, therefore, that it's great we're keeping it 311 for now. Like you said, it was needed because we're talking about these new technologies and stricter limits to make sure these cars are safe, not just sort of road safety as well, but also for climate change purposes.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the MOT over the years, as I mentioned earlier, I remember when sort of cars being presented for their first MOT at 3 years old were failing on corrosion.
Mm,
Thankfully, we don't see that so much now. And the emphasis of the MOT has changed. It's now more about the environment, about emissions and everything else. Um, and it's right that we protect our own health and those that, the future health of our children and grandchildren. So, that's got to be borne in mind. We talked about ADAS, and ADAS systems are on all new cars now. Whatever label a manufacturer puts it on, whatever badge it is literally hidden behind,
mm,
um, then testing those systems are right and proper, because it's a bit like ABS. When ABS came along and traction control and all those sorts of things, drivers start to rely on them.
mm,
Um, and when you're talking about adaptive cruise and early collision warning and lane keep assist and all that sort of stuff, drivers will come to rely on it
mm,
because it's there. Again, that reliability thing, they know it's going to work. But a lot of these systems don't put a warning light on the dashboard. And
mm,
they do need calibrating when certain things do, like steering geometry, suspension components renewed, windscreens renewed.
mm,
Um, so again, ultimately, they will probably find their way into the MOT. How long that will take, because what we need is a consistent approach
mm,
that's deliverable across every MOT station in the UK, so every customer gets the same service. So yes, the new technology will work its way into the MOT eventually, but it's that consistency bit that DVSA will have to be assured of, I
mm,
think, before they bring that in. And then that comes back to how much investment is needed on behalf of the garages
mm.
to actually deliver that to the consumer. And that's going to have to be reflected at some point in the value and pricing of MOTs.
Absolutely, because the MOT price hasn't changed in quite a number of years now, hasn't it? It's stayed around the
Yeah.
£55 mark, hasn't it? So,
Yeah, and I think because it's a maximum fee. We all know that that's sort of discounted at various places, and it's a marketing tool for some businesses, and it's a commercial decision.
mm,
Um, but in terms of the consumer, they've had the benefit of that for a long, long time.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and I think as more investment may be needed, it's something that again has to be reviewed and considered.
mm. And I guess as well, there's that section of society that will say, "Oh, garages will fail my car because they want to make the money on repairs. They'll find something really small that is almost nitpick it to try and get it in there." But I guess with the consensus of road safety that we saw in the consultation and in the lead up to the announcement with the various different surveys and things like that, it's good to see that actually the industry or the drivers back the MOT and that core that say this garage is only failing my car because X, Y, and Z is in the minority.
Yeah, I think again, nobody likes to think that their car's failed, because it means you're going to have to lay out some money on getting it repaired. Um, on the flip side of that, you speak to MOT testers whose customers come into the same garage on a regular basis and are seeing the same advisories a year on from the MOT that the customer just hasn't dealt with.
Mm,
There's a mechanism to stop that car failing, and that's the advisory.
mm,
And it's up to the road user to take advantage of that advisory. That's the professional pair of eyes
mm,
looking at that vehicle and saying, it's past now. However, you need to think about this going forward, because this is it's a potential to be safety related in the
mm,
not too distant future. And again, as a mechanism for road safety, that advisory. We've now got dangerous. We can categorise defects in terms of dangerous. So it's about the consumer getting used to that and not, if you like, being dismissive of an advisory
Mm.
just because the car's actually passed its MOT this time.
So what role do garages have to play in not just the MOT but road safety awareness? I mean, should technicians be talking to customers, highlighting the issues, talking through advisories maybe, just to sort of highlight the point that yes, this is something that is going to need doing within the next 12 months and making drivers a bit more aware. Because as you said, the generational gap is that people are becoming more reliant on the technology in the car to tell them what's gone wrong.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a number of things there. I think we're in challenging financial times for many. I
Mm,
mean, you can't look at a news website without things about energy costs and rent rises and everything else. And you know that's a fact of life. You can't ignore that. I think from an independent garage point of view, from our members' point of view, um, that one of the benefits that small independent garage has is the owner of the garage
mm,
probably is the one that meets the customer on the forecourt, that drives the vehicle into the workshop, that actually carries out that MOT and hands it back to the customer. So I
mm,
think those conversations in terms of, that there is this advisory, or we suggest that you think about this in 6 months' time, it is almost an unconscious service that they offer.
mm,
Um, the difficult bit is, can the customer afford that? And do they actually take it on board?
mm.
And I think most garages will advise their customer and spell out, if you like, the risks, and also the potential costs. But the cost of not doing some of that rectification work is greater because, you know, unlike ourselves, when we cut and bleed, your car doesn't heal up. It's
No.
only going to get worse if there's a defect that's been highlighted, or if there's been an advisory given. Then it's not going to get any better if you ignore it. It's important that consumers and road users act upon those advisories.
That's it, isn't it? Because yeah, the wear gets greater, the the potential for failure then gets greater, and
Yeah,
before you know it, you could be spending thousands of pounds on a repair that would have only cost you 100 or 200 had it been picked
absolutely.
up.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, if you get an advisory on brake pad wear this year,
Mm,
next year that could not just be brake pads, it could be brake discs and pads. Or, depending on the mileage and the way that brakes are used, it could be significantly worse
mm,
prior to the next MOT. So I say the MOT system's there for a reason. It's structured in a way that it will steer the consumer to keep their vehicle roadworthy. Um, but it's up to the end user of that vehicle to take that on board and realise that spending the money now, as much as that may hurt, is actually going to save them money in the long term.
And my last question, we've this isn't the first time we've talked about the MOT. It's not the first time it's gone for consultation. It's not the first time there's been a threat. It seems almost every other year there's something around the MOT, whether it is a consultation, whether it's a political party in general elections saying we're going to change it. Um, I think it feels like the MOT has almost become an easy target over recent years. So we're saying today that the MOT is safe, as it were. We're keeping it as it is. But is it really ever safe? As you said, should we be talking about it a bit more sort of going forwards?
I think it's inevitable. It's almost, if you think about it, it's a legislative financial burden put upon the road user, a bit like road tax and insurance. And they're all topics that sort of cause us grief because we've got to lay money out. But ultimately, what we've got to think about is the benefits that that provides. And again, we talked about evolving technology. So, will the MOT come under question again? I think its existence is almost guaranteed because of what it affords us in terms of road safety.
Mm,
Um, will it be questioned and challenged? Yes, because we don't know what technology is ahead of us in 10 years' time. And to make sure that the MOT is fit for purpose, to make sure that vehicles stay safe, it has to be reviewed, not just the content, but the value and how that's applied. You know, let's face it, if we start and see, let's talk about EVs again, going through suspension bushes every 6 months, in 10 years' time might be MOT in EVs at 6 months. I ain't saying we're gonna, I ain't recommending it. But
Mm,
what I'm saying is we don't know, because again, where we started out with in terms of EV and are they more reliable and everything else,
mm.
we don't know. They're too new and not in sufficient numbers for us to get a full view of how they're going to impact road safety going forward.
Excellent. And Frank, thanks very much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Great talking to you, Phil.
And thank you as well for listening on Apple, Spotify, Google, or Amazon Music to the Auto Repair Focus podcast. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's free. Or for watching along on our YouTube channel. And again, if you're listening to this on the podcast form, check out Auto Repair Focus on YouTube. And again, like and subscribe. All free, and you'll get a notification every time one of our multimedia features drops. Thanks very much. Speak to you soon.